A police officer stood at the door of a quiet village hall, checking who was allowed inside. Not because of a robbery, not because of a riot, because two ordinary people had been threatened with death over a farm shop's lunch menu. If you had told anyone in that village a year earlier that this is where things would end up, they would have laughed at you. This was supposed to be the most harmless planning dispute in England. A shed, a café, a form nobody outside the parish would ever bother reading. Instead, someone picked up a phone and said something so serious that police had to be involved. Not once, twice. Here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. The people receiving those threats were not the ones defending the farm. They were the ones opposing it. Ordinary residents, doing nothing more than filing a legal objection through the correct process, found themselves needing protection for it. If you're already leaning in wondering how a farm shop dispute ends with police protection, that's exactly the reaction this deserves, so hit subscribe right now, because the next few minutes explain something far bigger than one village, and you don't want to lose this one halfway through. Somewhere between filing an objection and fearing for your safety, something happened to the people involved that has nothing to do with sheds, cafes, or planning law at all. And that is the part almost nobody has ever properly explained. Because this is not really a story about a farm. It is a story about how ordinary, decent people can be pushed, one step at a time, into behaving like something they would never recognize in themselves. And once you understand how it happened here, you will start noticing the exact same pattern everywhere, in comment sections, in group chats, in disputes that have nothing to do with farming whatsoever. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how a dispute over a lambing shed produced a police report. You will understand why the council never saw it coming. And you will understand why the real danger in this story was never the building at all. Start with the shed, because everything genuinely begins here. Diddley Squat Farm needed somewhere to keep a new flock of sheep, so a lambing shed went up, ordinary, functional, the kind of building that exists on 10,000 farms across Britain without anyone mentioning it again. Except this one didn't stay a shed. Slowly, it became a cafe. Then it grew a bar area. Nobody applied for planning permission for either change. It simply happened, the way small expansions often happen when a business is popular and moving fast, and paperwork feels like something you'll get around to later. West Oxfordshire District Council noticed. They said the building was being used without consent as a restaurant and a cafe. They issued an enforcement notice. They ordered it closed. Jeremy Clarkson appealed the decision. He argued the site supported local farming and local tourism. The council disagreed. 53 formal objections were logged against the plan. 12 letters of support came in alongside them. Even the parish council held its own meeting on the issue and still couldn't agree on which side it stood on. That is a completely normal planning dispute. Britain runs thousands of them every single year, and the overwhelming majority end exactly the way you'd expect, quietly, on paper, decided by planning officers nobody outside the village will ever recognize. But here is where it gets interesting. The case moved to a formal appeal in front of an independent planning inspector. That kind of hearing is usually attended by a couple of council officials, a barrister, and maybe one half-asleep local journalist filling column inches before deadline. This one needed security at the door. The council later confirmed at least one death threat had been reported to police. 2 people had been targeted specifically. One was a sitting councillor. One was a private member of the public. The inspector running proceedings requested no filming and no photography inside the room, specifically to protect the people involved. Sit with that for a second. Somebody objected to a restaurant application through entirely legal means, and it frightened them enough that the state itself decided they needed shielding from members of the public. That is not proportionate. That is not normal. And that is exactly why this story deserves far more attention than it has ever received. Stop, because what comes next is the part that even people who followed this closely at the time never fully connected. The council was never trying to create a national headline. They were enforcing an ordinary planning breach, the kind their officers process routinely, month after month, without a single person outside the office ever hear about it. They believed they were handling paperwork quietly and professionally. Instead, they became the story. Within days, national outlets had picked it up. Not because of the shed, because of the threats. The council thought they were managing compliance. They were actually standing in the exact moment an ordinary local disagreement turned into something far bigger than themselves. Now here is where the psychology gets genuinely uncomfortable, and where almost every previous account of this story has stopped looking too closely. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to threaten a stranger's life over a farm shop. That is not how any of this works. It happens gradually, through a process that has been studied for decades, the same mechanism behind football violence. Online pylons and workplace feuds that spiral completely out of proportion to whatever actually started them. It begins with identity. The moment a person picks a side in a public dispute, they stop evaluating the argument on its own merits. They start defending their side because it has quietly become part of who they are. Disagreement stops feeling like a difference of opinion. It starts feeling like a personal attack on something they now consider theirs. Then comes escalation. Group loyalty rewards the loudest voice in the room, never the most reasonable one. Say something measured and nobody notices you at all. Say something furious and your own side applauds you for it, shares it, tells you you're right to be angry. So the temperature keeps rising, comment by comment, conversation by conversation, until somebody who would never dream of hurting another human being in their daily life finds themselves typing words they would be horrified to say out loud, face to face, to a real person standing in front of them. And then comes the final step, dehumanization, the exact moment an opponent stops being a neighbor, a fellow villager, someone you might nod to outside the shop on a Tuesday morning, and starts being nothing more than an obstacle standing between you and the outcome you want. That is the precise moment ordinary disagreement turns dangerous. Nobody planned to threaten anyone's life when this dispute began over a shed full of sheep. But somewhere along that exact path, identity, escalation, dehumanization, somebody arrived there anyway. And they are very unlikely to think of themselves as a dangerous person, even now. That is not an excuse. It is the mechanism. And once you understand it, you cannot unsee it in every other online argument you scroll past for the rest of your life. If you want more of this, the human behavior hiding underneath headlines everyone else only reports on the surface, make sure you're subscribed, because the next reveal flips this entire story on its head. Here is that reveal. Nobody has ever confirmed publicly who sent those threats or their exact motive, but the timeline only fits one explanation. The people under threat were not supporters of Clarkson's plan. They were the objectors standing against it, which means the intimidation did not come from critics of the farm. It came from people defending it. Say that back to yourself slowly, because it is the single strangest sentence in this entire story, and it happens to be true. The very people trying to protect their village from what they saw as unlawful development became the ones who needed police protection from people supposedly on their own side of the argument. A planning dispute that should have been settled quietly on the strength of its paperwork ended up being settled partly under the presence of security guards and an active police involvement. Whatever the eventual planning outcome turned out to be, that detail is the one that outlived it. Paperwork gets filed and forgotten. Fear does not. Now consider the second reveal, because it is just as strange as the first, and almost nobody has said it out loud. The objectors who were threatened were not opposing Clarkson personally. Many of them were opposing the precedent, a concern entirely reasonable on paper that a well-known landowner might be held to a different planning standard than anyone else in the district simply because of fame and attention. That is not an unreasonable position to hold in a functioning democracy. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of scrutiny planning law is supposed to invite. And yet holding that position, expressing it through entirely legitimate channels, was enough to put someone in a position where they needed police protection. Think about what that teaches anyone watching from the outside. If defending a process rather than attacking a person can still get you threatened, what does that do to the next person who might have spoken up about a completely different local issue? Somewhere in that village right now, there is very likely someone who saw exactly what happened here and quietly decided it wasn't worth objecting to anything ever again. That is the real cost of this story. Not the shed, not the enforcement notice, the silence it created afterward in people who were never even part of it. Look closely at what the council actually said publicly about all of this, because the exact wording matters more than it first appears. Not that Clarkson had done anything wrong personally. Not that the threats came from him, his team, or anyone connected to the farm directly. Only that opponents of the plan had been targeted, and that police were involved. A careful, narrow, deliberately restrained statement. The kind only written by people who already understand they are standing in the middle of something far bigger than a single lambing shed, and who know that one careless word could make it bigger still. You cannot fake that kind of caution. You can only find it in an organization that already knows the story has slipped completely out of its own hands. Now stand back, because this is where everything connects. This did not happen because of one farm, one shed, or one restaurant application. It happened because an ordinary local planning dispute became attached to one of the most recognizable names in the country. And attention does not stay proportionate to the thing that caused it. It multiplies, fast enough and long enough. And eventually the people caught inside it stop behaving like a quiet village council handling routine paperwork, and start behaving like the epicenter of a national story nobody in that village ever asked to be part of. That is not really a story about farming at all. It is a story about what fame does to disagreement, about how quickly ordinary, otherwise decent people can convince themselves that fear is a legitimate tool for winning an argument they care deeply about. And it plays out in smaller versions in almost every online dispute you have ever watched unfold. A school parents' WhatsApp group, a neighborhood Facebook page, a comment section underneath a completely unrelated video. The mechanism is identical every time, only the stakes are usually lower. And only because nobody happened to be famous enough to drag the entire country's attention into the room with them. That is the part that should actually stay with you longer than any detail about a farm shop. This is not a story about Jeremy Clarkson. It is a story about a mechanism that exists inside every one of us, waiting for the right combination of identity, escalation, and distance from the person on the other side of the argument. If that's landed with you at all, this is exactly the kind of story we go looking for every week. So make sure you're subscribed before the next one drops, because it goes even further into the parts of this saga nobody else has properly connected. Here is what genuinely remains unresolved, because this story deserves honesty rather than a tidy, satisfying ending. No individual has ever been publicly charged in connection with the threats, as far as the public record shows. Nobody has confirmed a motive beyond the obvious one already outlined here. The council has never said whether that hearing led to permanent changes in how future disputes are handled in the district, or whether it was treated as a single, isolated precaution never repeated since. Some parts of this story are simply still unknown. Any account that pretends otherwise, tying every loose thread into a neat and satisfying conclusion, is not being honest with you. What is certain is this. A dispute over a farm shop, the kind that usually ends quietly in a filing cabinet somewhere in a council office, ended instead with security guards, a police report, and a conversation about human behavior that reaches far beyond one Cotswolds village. That was never really a story about a shed. It was a story about how quickly ordinary people can be pushed past a line they never believed they would cross, and how easily any one of us could end up standing on either side of that same line, in a dispute entirely our own without ever noticing exactly how we got there. If this kind of story is the reason you keep coming back to this channel, not just the farming headlines everyone else covers, but the human truth sitting underneath them, subscribe now, because next week we go back into the one part of this saga almost nobody has properly told. And it starts with a number that changes how you see everything you just watched. Thank you, as always, for watching. Tell me honestly in the comments below, had you heard about this before today, or did this completely change how you see the whole diddly squat story?